back to the couch in my living room. January can be such a miserable time of year, at least if you're like me and you hate the cold, but I am also very much a seasonal reader, and I thought it would be fun to take a look at some of my favorite books that I have read around this time of year, or some of the books I wish I had read around this time of year. Beautiful frosted landscapes or some especially dark themes. I have some contemporary, historical, fantasy, and nonfiction recommendations. I'm losing light fast, so I will go ahead and jump in. For historical fiction, my number one recommendation is Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders. Even the cover is kind of gray and moody. The Bardo is a Tibetan Buddhist term that refers to kind of the liminal space between life and death. And this story extrapolates from the historical fact that while Abraham Lincoln was in office in the White House after the first year of the Civil War, his young son Willie passed away of typhoid fever. And the newspapers reported that Lincoln returned to the crypt several times in the next few days to hold his son and grieve privately. The story follows Willie and his father as they navigate this devastating transition, and it also talks a lot about public and private grieving and how some of the taboos we have around death, the dead, and grieving can kind of exacerbate the pain of loss. I sobbed reading this on the floor of an airport, and I just could not recommend it more strongly if I tried. It is beautiful. It's kind of bizarre. I recommend checking this one out, and if you are currently experiencing grieving or loss of any kind, I also recommend checking out Anderson Cooper's All There Is podcast, just as kind of a bonus recommendation. I found that both of those, in their own ways, really dive into the grieving process in really interesting and unique perspectives. My next recommendation is The Diamond Eye by Kate Quinn. This historical fiction story follows Lyudmila Pavlichenko, who was a real historical figure who is known as Lady Death. She was one of the most accurate snipers in World War II with over 300 recorded kills. Kate Quinn, the author, does a fantastic job of kind of exploring and bringing into focus a lot of the women who were previously relegated to the margins of history. Lyudmila was a real person, but this story is extremely fictionalized. With that being said, I thought it was fantastic. It follows Lyudmila's life in Ukraine before the war starts. She's a librarian, she was a student, she was a mother, and then it follows her throughout the war and the process of training and becoming a soldier, and then it follows her goodwill tour in America. This was where the plot went a little bit off the rails for me. It was definitely fictionalized, and I felt it was never more obvious than at that point in the story. But with that being said, if you're willing to go along for the crazy ride, I still thought this was really interesting and fun and fascinating. I like all of Kate Quinn's books, but this one in particular is bleak, cold, perfect for January. My final historical recommendation is Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles. If you haven't read this one yet, this January is the time. This is a literary fiction character study of Count Alexander Rostov. He's a fictional aristocrat who's sentenced to life imprisonment in Moscow's luxury hotel, the Metropole, and he spends about 30 years there, and we in the story spend 30 years with him in the confines of this hotel. So we're very restricted in terms of where we're going and who we're interacting with, and you would think that that would get really boring, but for me, I thought that this was funny, charming, and just completely beautiful. Alexander Rostov, if you have to follow one character for that long period, I thought he was a wonderful person to follow. He starts off very charming, and as the time goes on, he just comes to a series of kind of deeper revelations about himself, deeper relationships with the people around him. He grows an enormous amount. You get to see history kind of passing him by through the windows of the Metropole. There are some really significant historical events that take place in Moscow during that 30-year 1920s to 1950s period that I didn't know a lot about. But the story itself is mostly about Count Rostov and everything that he learns and experiences within the hotel. This is such a fun read, and obviously Moscow is a great place to be in January fictionally. As a contemporary read, I really recommend checking out Beartown by Friedrich Bachmann. All of Friedrich Bachmann's books are translated from Swedish, and this story takes place in a very remote Swedish town called Beartown. Their factory that employs most of their workers is closing down, and they are really struggling economically and kind of spiritually as a town when their junior boys hockey team starts to really excel. The town really pins all of their hopes and dreams on these very young shoulders and their success in the hockey arena, but when their team's captain commits a really devastating crime, the whole town splits, and they have to kind of decide whether winning is the most important thing or whether kind of the future of the town in its young people being raised correctly is what they're going to focus on. This story is remarkable in that it treats every single one of its characters really tenderly and empathetically, a really all-encompassing view of everyone involved in this crime and its aftermath. I thought it was really beautifully done. I thought it was also a really interesting exploration of masculinity and toxic masculinity, how that develops, where there's opportunities for intervention and why sometimes we don't take them. It's a trilogy. I have not yet read all 3 books. I read the second book and it's kind of emotionally heavy. I do recommend checking trigger warnings, so I have not yet gotten to the 3rd, but this January is a good time to check out Beartown. On to my favorite genre, which is always fantasy. I know a lot of people love the Bear and the Nightingale series by Catherine Arden, and if you haven't read that yet, forget everything else I've recommended. It's a beautiful fantasy story. It's in an incredible and lush winter wonderland. The prose is to die for, and I really especially loved all of the Russian traditional folklore and creatures that were brought into that story. For that reason, if you've read Bear and the Nightingale and you were looking for something similar, I recently read When Among Crows by Veronica Roth, and I'm going to recommend that one. It's not Bear and the Nightingale's equal in prose, but it does carry through one of my favorite elements, which is the cultural creatures and folklore incorporated into a fantasy storyline. This one is a contemporary fantasy about a young man who is seeking help to resolve kind of a personal anguish and quest. It includes a ton of Polish folklore and language. I thought this was really well done. I was shocked that it was written by the same author as Divergent, since it had a very different feel. There was a lot of evocative imagery in this story. The characters were really interesting, if not all the way resolved in terms of their character arcs. This is the first in a series, and I'm excited to explore the next several. So if you have read Bear and the Nightingale and you're looking to scratch some of that cultural folklore itch this winter, I would recommend When Among Crows, and its sequel, which just came out, To Clutch a Razor, is something that I will be looking into this winter. My next fantasy recommendation is The Wolf and the Whale by Jordana Max Brodsky. Omat, our protagonist, is an Inuit shaman who is raised during a time of prosperity, but when the Inuit gods seem to have turned on them and Omat's people are starving, they set off on a quest across this icy tundra to try and save their people and restore the favor of the gods. They encounter a Norse warrior, and there is an interesting clash of cultures and gods. It's a story about storytelling. There is a ton of cultural storytelling about gods, about cultural identity, but there's also a really interesting storyline about gender identity and the stories that we are told about ourselves and the stories that we learn to tell about ourselves. I was kind of disappointed to learn that Jordana Max Brodsky is not from the Inuit culture, and I am very interested to see if I can find books about that culture by people from that culture. But I thought this was a really interesting jumping off point and a really epic tale to dive into, especially if you're looking for kind of a chunky winter book. For nonfiction, I'm going to recommend Poverty by America. This was one of my best books of 2025 for good reason. Matthew Desmond does a wonderful job of examining poverty in the United States and its particularities within our systems, our culture, our economy. During the winter, when the gas prices have risen astronomically, the temperature is still extremely low, Christmas just came and went, this is a time I think it's really important to be thinking about your neighbors, your community members who are experiencing abject poverty, as well as to be thinking deeply about how far any of us are away from facing deep, debilitating poverty or even homelessness. I know that this is an issue that can be difficult to think or talk about, but I think Matthew Desmond does a really wonderful job of illustrating the social impacts, the health implications, the psychological implications, the day-to-day experience and exhaustion of living in poverty. This book is short, it packs an enormous punch. I still think about its themes and the facts that it lays out every single day. This January, I will be reading more about and doing more about the wealth and resource gaps in my own community. And if that's something you would like to dive into, I think this is a great jumping off point and this is a great time to do that. So as you can see, I have lost most of my daylight. It is in short supply here in January, but I hope I've given you something to try and dive into this winter. And please let me know if you have any recommendations for me about beautiful winter landscapes or any of those themes that I should be exploring before the days get long again. Bye!